Idris Khouri thought he had everything under control, until the moment his obsession with newlywed Liyana Farouq turned him from a respected Dubai police officer into the prime suspect in a chilling murder case that shattered every life it touched. Zayden Al-Masri had built his entire life around control. As one of Dubai's most respected officers in the Criminal Investigation Division, he valued precision, order, and absolute discipline. Every case he worked was efficiently handled, every decision carefully calculated. Yet for all his professional success, Zayden's personal life had remained empty for years. That changed the day he met Liyana Farouq, a striking flight attendant whose gentle presence softened the rigid world he lived in. Their courtship was swift, surprising even Zayden's closest colleagues, who never imagined he would marry so quickly. But Liyana brought something into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of calm he deeply craved. Liyana grew up far differently from Zayden. She came from a modest family in Sharjah, where expectations were high and opportunities limited. Becoming a flight attendant had been her escape from the pressures of her upbringing, allowing her to craft a life filled with movement, freedom, and independence. When she met Zayden during one of his business trips, she saw in him stability, security, and a future she could rely on. She admired his strength and composure, traits she believed would anchor her unpredictable lifestyle. Their connection felt promising, and soon they were married in a quiet but elegant ceremony overlooking the water. To friends and co-workers, the marriage appeared flawless. Zayden and Liyana posted photos of weekend getaways, quiet dinners, and romantic strolls through the marina. Their new apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows, polished marble floors, and a perfect view of the city's glittering skyline. But inside, the cracks were already forming. Liyana struggled to adapt to Zayden's structured routines, and Zayden didn't understand her need for emotional space. Their differences were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as ordinary newlywed adjustments, but they soon grew more noticeable. What Zayden didn't know was that Liyana had been carrying a heavy secret long before their marriage began. Months earlier, she had been involved with Idris Khouri, an ex-cop removed from the force due to violent misconduct and a string of disciplinary failures. Idris was everything Zayden was not: impulsive, intense, chaotic. Liyana had left him after several frightening episodes, swearing to herself she would never return to that unstable relationship. Falling for Zayden felt like choosing a safer life, one where she wouldn't have to fear unpredictable moods or emotional manipulation. But ghosts have a way of resurfacing at the worst possible times. After the wedding, Liyana made the mistake of responding to a single message from Idris. What began as a moment of closure quickly evolved into secret meetings and hidden conversations. Idris saw Liyana's marriage as a personal defeat. Her return, even briefly, reignited his sense of ownership over her. Liyana convinced herself it was harmless, just old emotions lingering in the shadows. But she underestimated Idris's ability to manipulate and his growing resentment. Meanwhile, Zayden's instincts sharpened. His training made him hyper-aware of behavioral shifts, and he noticed everything: Liyana's distractedness, her sudden reluctance to make future plans, the way she guarded her phone. He attempted to dismiss his suspicions as overthinking, but the signs were too clear. Jealousy was something he had never struggled with, yet now it clung to him like a second skin. His ability to stay objective weakened each time Liyana slipped away for unexplained reasons. The distance between them widened. Liyana felt trapped between guilt and fear, unsure how to confront the growing mess. Idris became bolder, demanding more of her attention. He insisted she deserved someone who understood her. His messages grew darker, laced with threats masked as passion. Liyana felt trapped in a tightening web woven by both men, a web she had willingly entered but now felt suffocated by. Zayden spent nights tracking Idris's habits, following him from a distance, mapping his daily routines. His surveillance was fueled by a chaotic blend of love, anger, and duty. He needed to understand Idris's intentions. He studied Idris's past cases, disciplinary files, and psychological assessments. The pattern was clear. Idris reacted violently when he felt abandoned or challenged. The thought of Liyana entangled with such a man made Zayden's blood run cold. As the days passed, the three of them moved like pieces on a board none of them fully understood. Liyana hid her fear behind trembling excuses. Idris schemed with obsessive determination. Zayden investigated with painful precision, uncovering more truth than he knew how to process. The triangle was tightening. Trust was gone. Fear was rising. And the foundation of Zayden and Liyana's marriage was cracking under the pressure of secrets and lies. The perfect facade they had shown the world was shattering piece by piece. And although none of them knew it yet, the first irreversible step towards tragedy had already been taken.
Idris Khouri spent his nights plotting. He had always been a man who thrived on control, and the moment he realized Liyana was drifting emotionally, he saw an opportunity to pull her deeper into his world. He told himself he loved her, but his version of love was a twisted, consuming need to possess. Every missed message from her increased his agitation. Every delay made him more convinced that Zayden was interfering. The idea of losing her triggered something dangerous in him, something he had kept hidden beneath charm and confidence for years. Liyana, on the other hand, felt her anxiety rising with every passing day. What had started as excitement had morphed into fear. Idris was no longer the witty, rebellious man she remembered. His tone had sharpened. His demands increased. He pressured her to leave the marriage, convinced she belonged with him. She regretted ever responding to his first message, but now she didn't know how to step away safely. Idris used information she had shared in moments of vulnerability to manipulate her, keeping her emotionally cornered. Zayden watched all of this from a distance he hadn't chosen. The discovery of the affair had fractured something inside him, but he wasn't the type to act recklessly. Instead, he observed quietly, learning everything he could. He used his investigative skills to track Idris without alerting him. He noted patterns in his movements, unusual phone activity, and late-night disappearances. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Idris was becoming unpredictable. Zayden feared not just for his marriage, but for Liyana's safety. The situation escalated when Zayden received an anonymous envelope left at his office desk. Inside was a set of printed photos showing Idris and Liyana together at a distant beach outside Dubai. The images were recent, taken within the last 2 weeks. Zayden recognized the shoreline immediately. It was a place often used for discreet meetings. The photos weren't meant for humiliation. They were a warning. Someone wanted him to know the danger was growing. Zayden's instincts sharpened. He increased his surveillance on Idris, following him on foot and by car. One night he watched Idris enter a small apartment in an older part of the city. The lights flickered on, and Idris paced the room, talking angrily to himself. The intensity in his movements confirmed everything Zayden feared. Idris wasn't just having an affair with Liyana, he was unraveling. Liyana sensed the storm building around her. She noticed Zayden's quiet shifts in behavior, Idris's rising aggression, and the internal guilt that refused to let her sleep. She feared Idris discovering she wanted to cut ties, but she also feared Zayden confronting him. Both men were capable, strong-willed, and deeply emotional beneath their professional facades. She felt like she was standing between two explosives, waiting for one to ignite the other. The breaking point came when Idris found out Liyana had ignored several of his calls. He sent a series of messages that grew increasingly alarming. He accused her of betraying him, demanded she meet him immediately, and threatened consequences if she continued avoiding him. Liyana felt her heart pounding as she read through the messages. She knew she couldn't keep this hidden any longer. Across the city, Zayden was staring at the same messages. Liyana had forwarded them to him in a shaky moment of desperation. Her short note, only a few sentences, was enough to signal she was afraid. For the first time since discovering the affair, Zayden's protective instincts overshadowed his heartbreak. Liyana was in danger, and Idris was crossing lines he had only threatened before. Zayden grabbed his keys and prepared for what he knew would be a confrontation. He wasn't sure what he would say or how he would keep himself controlled, but he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The situation could no longer be observed from the shadows. And in a city built on luxury and order, something dark was about to erupt beneath the glossy surface. Idris Khouri drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before stopping at a deserted parking lot on the outskirts of Dubai. The dim yellow street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement, mirroring the tangled emotions twisting inside him. His anger had grown uncontrollable. Every unanswered call from Liyana replayed of his mind like an insult. He convinced himself she was slipping away, not toward safety, but back into Zayden's grip. To Idris, that was betrayal, and betrayal demanded punishment. Inside his car, he rehearsed scenarios over and over, confronting her, forcing her to choose, making sure she understood he wasn't someone who could be dismissed. He blamed Zayden for everything, convincing himself that Liyana still loved him, but was afraid of her husband's authority. It never occurred to him that she was afraid of Idris instead. His mind had created a version of reality that justified every dangerous impulse. Meanwhile, Liyana sat alone in her living room, trembling. She had locked all the doors, closed every curtain, and kept the lights low. Her phone lay on the table, screen dark but heavy with unread messages. She knew Idris wouldn't let the night pass quietly. The tone in his last messages revealed a man ready to act, not merely venting frustrations. She regretted ever receiving comfort in someone from her past, but now she didn't know how to step away safely. Zayden arrived home with his mind already in tactical mode. He noticed the silence as soon as he stepped inside. The air felt heavy, tense, as if the walls themselves sensed the threat closing in. He spotted Liyana sitting stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. When she looked up, he saw fear. Not guilt, not shame, just raw fear. It told him more than words ever could. Zayden checked the doors, windows, and exterior cameras without saying anything. His training guided every movement. He wasn't preparing for an argument. He was preparing for a potential attack. Idris had never been violent during his time in law enforcement, but Zayden knew the type. Men who appeared controlled until life pushed them against the wall. When emotional obsession mixed with training, the result was unpredictable and often catastrophic. Across the city, Idris made up his mind. He started the engine, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached. The path to Zayden and Liyana's house felt disturbingly familiar. He had driven it many times before during their brief secret meetings, but tonight he wasn't coming as a lover. He was coming as someone who believed he had been wronged. He felt entitled to answers, confrontation, and whatever form of closure his unstable emotions demanded. As he drove, his thoughts tangled into something darker. He imagined Liyana confessing she still loved him. He imagined forcing Zayden to admit he had been the obstacle all along. Then the fantasies turned more violent. He told himself he wouldn't go that far, but the anger twisting in his chest blurred the boundaries between intention and impulse. Zayden sensed the moment things shifted outside. He moved quietly through the house, checking angles and sight lines like he was entering a crime scene rather than protecting his own home. He noticed the faint sound of an engine slowing on the street. His instincts sharpened instantly. He reached for his phone, but didn't dial yet. He wanted confirmation before escalating this into an official emergency. Then the headlights appeared through the gap in the curtains. Idris's car stopped in front of the house. Zayden felt his body go still. Liyana's breath caught in her throat. Outside, Idris sat motionless for several seconds before slowly opening his door. The metallic click echoed through the quiet neighborhood, marking the beginning of a night none of them would ever forget. Idris stepped out of the car and stood beneath the street lamp, the glow outlining his stiff posture. His breathing was shaky, uneven, as if he were trying to calm a storm swirling inside him. He stared at the house he once entered freely, believing he had a place in Liyana's life. Now he saw it as a fortress protecting her from him, a symbol of rejection he couldn't accept. The quiet street only intensified the chaos in his thoughts. He imagined Zayden inside, gloating, believing he had won. That single idea pushed Idris toward a breaking point. Inside the house, Zayden moved Liyana away from the front window and positioned her behind him. He could feel her trembling through the air, even without touching her. Years of handling volatile situations had trained him to focus, but this was different. This wasn't a stranger or a criminal. This was a man who once wore the same uniform, understood the same strategies, and now stood on their doorstep, consumed by obsession. Zayden knew that made Idris even more dangerous. Someone with training and emotional instability could turn a confrontation into a tragedy within seconds. Idris walked up the path, each step heavy and deliberate. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but the closer he got, the more his thoughts collapsed into confusion. His hands shook with a mixture of rage and desperation. The porch light flicked on suddenly, startling him. It was a simple automated system, but Idris took it as a challenge, a sign that Zayden was trying to intimidate him. His pulse surged. He moved faster toward the door, no longer thinking clearly. Zayden placed himself near the entryway, his body angled for protection and control. He heard the footsteps approaching, unsteady, uncoordinated, but purposeful. When the first hard knock reverberated through the house, Liyana flinched. Zayden stayed still, assessing the danger with every fiber of his training. He didn't answer the door. He knew opening it could create an immediate physical threat. He needed to buy time, keep Idris contained outside until the situation could be handled safely. Idris's knocks grew louder, more frantic. He called out, but his voice was too distorted by emotion to form coherent arguments. His frustration climbed until he began pounding on the door with enough force to shake the frame. He felt ignored, dismissed, exactly what he feared most. In his unraveling state, desperation began replacing reason entirely. Zayden reached for his phone and silently alerted law enforcement. He knew backup wouldn't be far, but the minutes until they arrived would feel dangerously long. He signaled Liyana to move farther from the entryway, ensuring she was out of sight. She stumbled back, tears pressing at her eyes. She wanted the nightmare to end. She wanted Idris to disappear. But now he was just feet away, breaking down the door of the life she was trying desperately to rebuild. As he did that, Idris stepped back as if preparing to force his way in. Zayden's instincts sharpened.
Idris stepped out of the car and stood beneath the street lamp, the glow outlining his stiff posture. His breathing was shaky, uneven, as if he were trying to calm a storm swirling inside him. He stared at the house he once entered freely, believing he had a place in Liyana's life. Now he saw it as a fortress protecting her from him, a symbol of rejection he couldn't accept. The quiet street only intensified the chaos in his thoughts. He imagined Zayden inside, gloating, believing he had won. That single idea pushed Idris toward a breaking point. Inside the house, Zayden moved Liyana away from the front window and positioned her behind him. He could feel her trembling through the air, even without touching her. Years of handling volatile situations had trained him to focus, but this was different. This wasn't a stranger or a criminal. This was a man who once wore the same uniform, understood the same strategies, and now stood on their doorstep, consumed by obsession. Zayden knew that made Idris even more dangerous. Someone with training and emotional instability could turn a confrontation into tragedy within seconds. Idris walked up the path, each step heavy and deliberate. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but the closer he got, the more his thoughts collapsed into confusion. His hands shook with a mixture of rage and desperation. The porch light flicked on suddenly, startling him. It was a simple automated system, but Idris took it as a challenge, a sign that Zayden was trying to intimidate him. His pulse surged. He moved faster toward the door, no longer thinking clearly. Zayden placed himself near the entryway, his body angled for protection and control. He heard the footsteps approaching, unsteady, uncoordinated, but purposeful. When the first hard knock reverberated through the house, Liyana flinched. Zayden stayed still, assessing the danger with every fiber of his training. He didn't answer the door. He knew opening it could create an immediate physical threat. He needed to buy time, keep Idris contained outside until the situation could be handled safely. Idris's knocks grew louder, more frantic. He called out, but his voice was too distorted by emotion to form coherent arguments. His frustration climbed until he began pounding on the door with enough force to shake the frame. He felt ignored, dismissed, exactly what he feared most. In his unraveling state, desperation began replacing reason entirely. Zayden reached for his phone and silently alerted law enforcement. He knew backup wouldn't be far, but the minutes until they arrived would feel dangerously long. He signaled Liyana to move farther from the entryway, ensuring she was out of sight. She stumbled back, tears pressing at her eyes. She wanted the nightmare to end. She wanted Idris to disappear. Instead, he was just feet away, breaking down the door of the life she was trying desperately to rebuild. Idris stepped back, as if preparing to force his way in. Zayden's instincts sharpened. He positioned himself in the safest defensive stance possible without escalating the situation. Idris charged forward with his shoulder, slamming it against the door. The impact jolted through the wood. He tried again, harder. The screws groaned, the lock strained. He wasn't thinking about consequences anymore, only about forcing his way into a reality slipping through his fingers. And just as the doorframe began to splinter, the distant wail of sirens reached the street. The sound cut through Idris like a blade. He froze, his breathing hitched. His mind, seconds ago consumed by fury, now flooded with fear of what he had done and what would follow. He backed away from the door, eyes wide, hands shaking uncontrollably. Police cars rounded the corner, red and blue lights flashing across the quiet neighborhood. Idris turned toward them, panic swallowing the last of his control. The officers halted their vehicles and stepped out with caution, recognizing immediately that this was a man at the brink of collapse. Zayden stayed inside, ensuring Liyana remained safe until the scene was secured. He listened as the officers ordered Idris to stand down. Idris sank to his knees on the pavement, overwhelmed by everything he had lost, everything he had ruined, and everything he had become before obsession destroyed him. Liyana cried softly from the hallway. It was the sound of relief mixed with grief. Grief for the safety she no longer felt. Grief for the chaos that had invaded her life. And grief for the man Idris once was before obsession destroyed him. Outside, Idris was taken into custody under the streetlight where his unraveling had started. The night ended not with violence, but with a man broken by the consequences of his own dark spiral.
Idris sat in the holding cell with his hands clasped tightly together, staring at the gray floor beneath his feet. The adrenaline had drained from his body, leaving behind a hollow heaviness he couldn't escape. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him, casting a sterile glow that made the space feel even smaller. For the first time since the downward spiral began, he had enough clarity to face what he had done. His attempt to break into Zayden and Liyana's home wasn't just a desperate act, it was a crime that shattered the final remnants of the person he once believed himself to be. Now, stripped of authority and dignity, he was left alone with the reality he had created. Back at the house, Liyana spent the next morning in a state of exhaustion, moving slowly through the rooms as though each step required effort. She hadn't slept. Every sound during the night felt like another threat. Even though Idris was behind bars, the fear lingered like a shadow, stubborn and heavy. Her home, the place meant to hold her marriage, her safety, her future, felt tainted by the chaos that exploded at the door. She tried to tidy up the living room, but her hands trembled each time she touched something. She felt responsible, even though she knew Idris's choices were not hers to carry. Yet guilt clung to her anyway, a quiet torment that whispered through the silence. Zayden watched her carefully, observing the subtle changes in her movements, the way she avoided looking at the door, the way she startled easily. He understood trauma well, too well. But seeing it in someone he cared about deeply turned his understanding into something heavier. He wanted to protect her, rebuild her sense of safety,
but he also knew recovery couldn't be forced. It needed space, patience, and time. He decided to take leave from work, knowing she needed stability more than anything. For now, staying close was the best thing he could offer. At the police station, investigators reviewed Idris's case. His history as an officer complicated matters. They knew he was trained, disciplined, capable, but also emotionally unstable in this particular incident. Some felt sympathy, recalling his service. Others believed he had crossed a line too dangerous to ignore. His attempted forced entry, his emotional volatility, and his fixation on someone else's wife made him a potential danger. While he hadn't physically harmed anyone, the intent behind his actions carried weight. The charges would not be light. He had become the kind of man he once arrested, a reality that burned bitterly in his mind. News of the incident began spreading quietly among law enforcement circles. Colleagues who once respected Idris spoke about him in hushed tones now, some shocked, others claiming they had noticed his behavior changing months earlier. His fall from grace became a cautionary story whispered through hallways. The idea of a respected officer losing everything over an emotional entanglement struck fear into those who recognized how quickly personal turmoil could infect professional judgment. Liyana finally agreed to stay with her sister for a few days. She needed distance from the house, from the scene of the near break-in, and from the memories that now echoed through every corner. Zayden supported the decision. He packed her things with care, making sure she took only what she needed. The rest could wait. He drove her quietly, allowing the silence to sit between them without forcing conversation. She leaned her head against the window, watching the city pass by in blurred shapes, feeling detached from everything around her. As she settled in at her sister's place, Zayden returned to the house alone. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. He walked through each room slowly, replaying the events in his mind, not with fear, but with analysis. He studied the door Idris had nearly broken through, the marks still visible in the wood. He pictured how badly things could have gone. He had faced danger countless times on duty, but the threat targeting his own home carried a deeper sting. It wasn't just an attack on safety, it was an attack on trust, stability, and peace. Idris, sitting alone in confinement, thought about the relationship that had brought him here. What began as comfort had twisted into obsession. He realized he had convinced himself that Liyana depended on him, when in reality, she never wanted more than emotional reassurance during a confusing moment in her life. He had built entire fantasies around small gestures, misinterpreting them until they felt like promises. Now those illusions collapsed, leaving only regret. As the days passed, each character confronted the new version of their lives. Liyana tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Zayden fortified his emotional guard, determined not to let danger breach their world again. Idris waited for his hearing, thinking endlessly about the man he had become. The night of the attempted break-in marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one shaped by consequences, healing, and the long, difficult process of rebuilding what obsession had nearly destroyed.
In the weeks that followed the attempted break-in, the lives of everyone involved shifted into unfamiliar territory. Liyana remained at her sister's apartment, occupying a small guest room that overlooked a quiet courtyard. The soft sound of wind brushing through the palms below helped her sleep a little better than she had at home. Yet she still awoke some nights with her heart racing, convinced she had heard Idris outside the door. Her mind clung stubbornly to the trauma, replaying the knock that shook her home and the heavy thudding of his attempts to break through. She wanted to forget, but fear made her memory sharper than ever. Her sister tried to support her by offering small comforts, meals, company, gentle conversation. But Liyana often drifted into silence. She struggled to focus on ordinary things. Her thoughts circled endlessly around how everything had escalated, how she had let herself get involved with Idris, and how her innocent search for understanding during a difficult moment in her marriage had turned into something dangerous and uncontrollable. Shame mixed with fear until she felt stuck in a loop that stretched on without pause. Zayden visited every day after checking in with his unit at the police station. He carried bags of groceries, updates, and quiet reassurances. Though he tried to hide it, the entire situation weighed heavily on him. He had always prided himself on being able to protect the people he cared about, yet seeing Liyana so shaken made him feel as though he had failed her somehow. He reminded himself that Idris's actions were not predictable, not logical, and not something a husband could reasonably foresee. But guilt had a way of ignoring logic. It settled deep in him, making him restless. Their conversations in those early weeks were short and cautious. Neither wanted to reopen the wound. Liyana avoided eye contact sometimes, worrying that Zayden blamed her. Zayden, for his part, feared pushing her too hard or asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. The distance wasn't intentional. It was the natural result of two people caught in the aftermath of chaos, trying to figure out how to rebuild without reopening pain. Although the days grew quieter for Liyana and Zayden, Idris's world grew louder and more suffocating. He waited in a detention facility while the court arranged dates for hearings and evaluations. His fall from authority to incarceration was abrupt and jarring. The other detainees regarded him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. News of his actions had spread through the ranks. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about him. Some believed he was mentally unstable. Others thought he had let personal problems corrupt his judgment. To Idris, the whispers felt like knives carving away the last remnants of his pride. He spent most days staring at the cracked walls, replaying the events in fragmented pieces. Each piece brought shame, the obsessive thoughts, the angry jealousy, the distorted fantasies he had mistaken for love. He knew he had betrayed everything he once represented as an officer. Yet, despite the clarity that hindsight offered, he couldn't erase the emotional storm that had led him here. He felt trapped inside a mind that once justified every impulsive step toward destruction. As part of the legal process, Idris went under a psychological evaluation. The specialist assigned to him noted the signs of obsessive attachment, emotional instability, and the inability to accept rejection. Idris listened quietly during the sessions, sometimes nodding, sometimes looking away. When the evaluator spoke about boundaries and distorted perceptions, he felt exposed, like someone was peeling apart the version of himself he had once clung to. Each session forced him to confront not only what he had done, but also who he had become without realizing it. Meanwhile, the police department issued an official statement acknowledging Idris's arrest and confirming an internal investigation into his conduct. Colleagues who once welcomed him avoided mentioning his name. For Zayden, hearing Idris talked about coldly in the hallways stirred complicated emotions. He felt anger for what Idris had done for Liyana, but he also felt sadness for the colleague he once respected. The betrayal cut both ways, professional and personal. After several weeks, Zayden invited Liyana to return home for a brief visit. He wanted her to see the house not as a place of trauma, but as part of her life that she could reclaim. Liyana hesitated at first, but the idea of confronting her fear rather than letting it dictate her future slowly grew in her mind. When they finally arrived, she stood outside the door for several minutes before going in. Her heart pounded, but she took steady breaths, grounding herself. Inside, the house felt familiar and distant. The living room was exactly as she remembered it, yet the memory of Idris's blows against the door still lingered like an invisible stain. Zayden remained beside her without crowding her. He let her move at her own pace, acknowledging quietly that healing didn't follow a schedule. After walking through each room, Liyana sat down on the sofa and allowed herself to breathe more freely. She didn't feel entirely comfortable, but the feeling of dread had softened slightly. Zayden sat across from her, studying her expression with gentle concern. For the first time since the incident, she looked at him without flinching.
She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the worry he had carried silently for weeks. Something inside her softened. She realized he had been hurting too, not outwardly, but in the quiet way people do when they hold themselves responsible for events they couldn't control. They didn't discuss Idris, not yet, but the silence between them felt less like distance and more like space, space to breathe, space to rebuild trust, and space to begin healing together. Later that afternoon, Zayden received a call informing him of Idris's upcoming court date. He didn't share the details with Liyana yet, knowing she needed more time before confronting that chapter again. But he understood the case would soon reach its conclusion, and with it, a turning point for all of them. As evening approached, Liyana made a decision. She wanted to sleep at home that night. The fear hadn't vanished, but she refused to let it control her forever. Zayden agreed without hesitation, promising to stay close and keep the house secure. That night, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house. Slowly, the tension in her body eased. For the first time in weeks, she drifted into sleep without the sharp jolt of panic. Idris, miles away in his cell, also lay awake. The consequences of his choices were closing in. His trial would determine his fate, but the verdict that weighed most heavily was the one he had already delivered upon himself. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The chapter of obsession was ending. What remained was accountability, healing, and the long-awaited closure that all three of them desperately needed.